I wanted to show you how to apply the roof cap in lesson 2. However, somewhere along the line I managed to either delete or misplace the footage showing you how to do this. All it is a piece of styrene plastic glued to the top of the cab. Again, we haven't poured concrete on this. This is all temporary glued together for the moment. In the meantime, what I want to do is cut these down and get them to the correct size. How are we going to do that? Simply by taking a small saw like this and cutting along the die cast. I'm using the die cast itself as a guide so I don't cut too deep or not enough. And you can see how, and I'm not putting a lot of pressure on this because I don't want the plastic to come loose. As you can see here, we've got a nice level line going across our die cast and plastic. Next, we're going to take off the plastic around the edge of the cab. For that process, I like to trim the excess off with a sharp knife. I'm sanding the excess off with a piece of 150 grit sandpaper, wrapped up in a file for a nice hard surface, and that will give us a nice smooth finish. Very good. I like what we have going on here. Excellent. That is looking really nice. So let's take a look at that close. Again, this looks ugly for now. We're not going to worry about that just yet. We know that it's going to get better. Using the same sanding drum I used before to cut the curve here in the front of the fender, and we're going to cut the same on the back side, leaving a flat spot right underneath the door. Now what we're going to do is test fit the cab on a frame to make sure that we have the fenders the correct size. And I think what I'm going to do is move my curve back just a little bit on both sides, so when we go ahead and attach the front grille, that there's a little more distance between the grille and the tires. And to see if we're getting close, I'm going to measure from the back of the cab to the front edge of our fender here and just see if we're close on both sides. So it looks like we are right at 5/8 or so inches. And right at 5/8. So what that tells me is that we went ahead and got the curve, at least the point of the curve, even on both sides of the cab. I'm going to go ahead and trim away any excess plastic that was left over from the sanding process. Also, I'm going to make sure that this is a nice flat spot and trim away any plastic, thin pieces of plastic that might be left in the die cast toward the front of the curve. And I'm just eyeballing that part of it. Next, like I said, this looks pretty ugly yet, so I don't want to have that way. As I mentioned before, this still looks kind of ugly. We don't want to leave it that way, so I'm going to take a piece of sandpaper on a file using the same 150 grit I used before. We're just going to kind of gently sand away any excess burrs and make sure that there's no cut edges. Excellent, just what I want. That makes it nice and clean and makes it look quite a bit better across the bottom. Very happy with that. That's going to be all right. Okay, I mentioned before that we're going to take JB Weld and put that on the inside of the cab to marry these two permanently. So we're going to do that now. If you followed me very long, you'll know that whenever I mix JB Weld, I like to keep these lids from butter dishes and different plastic containers in the house. Rather than discard them right away, I like to keep them for the following purpose. They are a great place to mix up JB Weld. We are going to discard them anyway. We're just delaying that a little bit. I'm being a little generous, but we do have to keep in mind we got to stick an interior back in here, so we don't want to just spread too much out, because we're going to have to modify the interior anyway, so we just want to be a little careful that we don't get too carried away. Also, we had mentioned before, we're going to go ahead and we're going to close up these holes on the back of the cab so we have a nice smooth cab, a nice smooth back on our cab. So we'll go ahead and do that too. To accomplish this and give you a nice clean look, take some electrical tape and put that over the holes, and then put your JB Weld on the inside. What will happen is the JB Weld will not spill out where you'll have to sand the back of the cab. Our JB Weld is now dry. You can see where the tape has made a nice smooth surface where the JB Weld came through the holes here. Not so much over there, not the JB Weld's fault, more the applicator. Nevertheless, we are now ready to go ahead and apply glazing putty. This works very well. It's easy to use, it's simple, and does a nice job of hiding seams. You can be a little generous with it because it is, like I said, easy to work with, so if you make a mess, you get too much on, it's simple to sand and not a big problem. Okay, I think I'm happy with that. We'll let that dry, come back tomorrow and sand away. The body filler is now dry. What we're going to do is take some sandpaper, and I'm going to wrap that sandpaper in a file. And the reason for that is when you put that sandpaper around your thumb and you push with your thumb, the pressure is different on your thumb versus a solid flat surface. So when you're pushing with your thumb, if there's any inconsistency or variation in the die cast, your thumb's actually going to put pressure into those creases and divots, not giving you a flat surface. So if we take a piece of sandpaper, wrap it around a hard surface, doesn't have to be a file, but this is what I use. You can get in there and you can sand evenly across the whole surface of your die cast. There's a line of diecast right here along the top edge of the cab. We want to be careful when we're sanding not to get too aggressive right here, as we will remove part of the line and then have part of it extending. So we want to come in as much as we can from the side and try and remove that body filler and clean that up as best we can. Also, on the back side of the cab, we had left a tiny bit of diecast from a door that was around the back side of the cab before we cut it. We're going to sand that off by hand, and then we also have some diecast right here behind the fender that we can take off as well. I also like to keep a selection of flat files. These are pin files that you can buy about any hardware store. They're pretty inexpensive and do make a nice addition to your tool cabinet. Also, when filing right through here, be careful not to put too much pressure on your piece of plastic we use to cover up our hole, our gap. That way we don't push it out. It can happen, so just be careful as you're filing here or sanding. And our goal here is to blend these lines so they're not noticeable. We're not being too aggressive about taking off material. If there's any body filler in the grooves, you can take a knife and remove that. Right here there's a noticeable seam. I'll go back and fill that in. But what we'll do first is we're going to go ahead and take off the rest of the body filler, get everything sanded down. Then I want to prime this thing. That way all the colors look the same and any imperfections will be noticeable. Sometimes I found, for example, when you have this, imperfections can hide in all those colors. So if you prime it, make it all one color, then you can see any variations. Obviously we could see the seam probably here, and anything else that maybe we want to touch up before we go to color. Once this first sanding is done, then we're ready to clean it and prime and paint like we normally would. To clean the model for this first round of primer, I'll go ahead and wipe it down with lacquer thinner on a rag. The lacquer thinner will not bother the plastic provided you don't spend much time there. Just go ahead and wipe it off, wipe it on, then wipe it off. And now we are ready to give a first round of primer. To clip the model, you can clip right up here in the front, as that's all going to be hidden by a grill. So if you don't get a little bit of primer or paint right in that area, not a problem. Our primer is on and just a little damp yet, but as we begin to take a look at this and evaluate how we did, you can see that overall on this particular model it's looking pretty good. We don't have a very visible seam along the passenger side. Down here at the bottom, we could take a little bit of body filler and fill in this little spot here. I don't know that we'd gain much because there's not much to stick to. We could take a piece of sandpaper and maybe touch up this line right here where the plastic joins the die cast. We could take our X-Acto knife and clear out right below the door that little seam there. Looks like it might have some body filler dust in it. It shouldn't be dust, but it might be some leftover body filler I missed. And it might be a small blem right here where that is a leftover indentation from the cabinet that was on the sleeper. On the back side of the cab, I can notice, and it may not show up well in the shot, right here where we put body filler in these holes in the back, those are still noticeable. Down here, I thought those were clean and neat before we primed, and obviously they're not, so a little sandpaper right here, or even filing. But we can touch that up with body filler and sand that smooth. Another little gap right here on the seam between the plastic on the cab and the die cast. Moving to the driver's side. This turned out much cleaner than I expected it to be. I'm actually pretty surprised. I figured we have a noticeable seam here and then a noticeable seam up here at the top, and as you can tell, really, I don't think I'm going to do anything on the driver's side. This is just pretty darn clean and neat. I think we can get away with it as it is. One oddball thing on the top, it looks like there's a piece of dust or something that may have come off the nozzle when I was painting. I'll just knock that off and then reprime it a little later.